You are watching a video in the Woodlawn series. We sat down with a number of individuals who either worked in, lived in, or invested in the Woodlawn neighborhood. From those conversations, we hope to learn from and learn about Woodlawn.
Hello, my name is David Helm. I am the senior pastor of Christ Church Chicago. We are recently the owners of what historically was St. John the Baptist Temple on the northwest corner of 62nd and Woodlawn. You can learn more about us at christchicago.org. And I want to welcome you today to this continuing series and episodes we're doing on Woodlawn, learning from and learning about. Today, I have a pastor from Woodlawn with me. I met him in January of 2019. I've spent many times with him over the table and in prayer. And I'm pleased to welcome Pastor Jeff Campbell. He is the pastor of the historic Woodlawn Baptist Church, which is directly south of where we are on 62nd. And he is one block to the west. He holds a BA from Trinity International Divinity School. Trinity International University, and has been in pastoral ministry for decades and is a mentor to many. Pastor Campbell, welcome. I'm so glad you're with us.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's good to be here and good to be able to talk about an area that I love, actually, the area of Woodlawn.
Yeah, so let's start there, because let's just have people get a sense of your role. How long have you been the pastor of Woodlawn Baptist Church? And just how did that connection emerge for you?
So I have been the pastor here since January of 2014. So I'm into, I guess, the 6th year now. I think of it as 5 years. I grew up, believe it or not, in the building you all just purchased. I became an attendee there at the age of 6. And I joined the church at the age of 9. I have maintained my membership all of my life at that church, St. John Temple, and I'm currently a member of St. John Temple. And so I was aware of Woodlawn Baptist. We had numerous events and fellowships together. And in 2013, the church came on my heart, and it was heavy on my heart. So much so that I called and inquired about the pastor who had been here for 50 years. And asked about him and what was going on. It turned out he was ill at the time. And later that year, he passed, actually. And I came here to his memorial service. Sitting in the sanctuary, I heard in my spirit, you need to help this church. And I presented myself to them and offered to help. At the time, I was pastoring a church down in Bronzeville. And they had some issues that they needed to resolve, and I had the skills to help them resolve. And so we began to talk, and I helped them resolve some legal issues and some temporal issues amongst the congregation. And I made a suggestion of how they might go forward with acquiring a new pastor. Yeah.
And you didn't know at the time that you would be the one you were suggesting.
Not at all. A week or so later, I got a call asking me if I would fulfill the role, which was supposed to be a temporary role. And I prayed about it, and I agreed to do that. So for a 2-year period of time, I pastored this church as an interim pastor, and the church that I had been at for 24 years. Interestingly enough, I had associates at that church. I had 6 other ministers there, so we could kind of rotate out. And so the weight wasn't as heavy as it could have been.
Tell us, that's a wonderful story, and I want to come back to some of those early years in a bit, but I want to keep talking about Woodlawn Baptist Church for a moment. What would someone who's not familiar with the history of Woodlawn Baptist Church need to understand? Tell us about the history of Woodlawn Baptist Church, its unique contributions in the neighborhood. You yourself, of course, are not only leading the church, but you're a leader in the community. But just a little bit about the history of Woodlawn Baptist Church. It'll be especially interesting for our folks who are getting ready to be your neighbor.
And so Woodlawn Baptist Church was brought here to this corner in the 1800s, in the late 1890s. It had been formed about 6 blocks to the east of here as a Baptist church in the community, and it was the first denominational Baptist church in the community. At the time, the community was all Caucasian, and it was a purely American Baptist Caucasian church. Over time, the membership here as the community began to change. And in the process, there was the normal process of how do you handle change when it's coming. And the people here, fortunately, had the wisdom to be accepting of change while at the same time dealing with keeping their heritage. And so in the early 30s, the church became multicultural by hosting 2 services. And the first service during the day was the normal service. Second service was in Chinese.
Wow.
And because the neighborhood was becoming mixed in that manner, they held that type of a service. In the late 40s, early 50s, there was a Spanish component or a Hispanic component in the community. And so that Chinese service became a Hispanic service. In the late 50s, the church, after going through some of the same turmoil that our country was going through, actually took a vote to allow the quote unquote Negro to become a part of the church. And so the church has a multicultural history, just as the Woodlawn area has a multicultural history. But as Woodlawn also ultimately became completely African American, so the church became basically an African American church. About 5 years ago, the last person of a different culture died off. And I give her credit; she hung in there to the end.
So how do you think that history is affecting the church or Woodlawn Baptist, as far as you have a unique vantage point of seeing challenges and changing times, and a renewed capital investment and a renewed push of a multiracial community coming in? How has your own history uniquely situated you advantageously, or what kind of challenges have you found as a congregation?
So when I came here with an understanding that it was my task to maintain the cultural heritage of the church, which means that this church that had become a purely African American church had to get on the road of becoming a multicultural church again. And that has proved to be a little challenging, only because some of the constituents here in the church are older and they came from the South. And so they have a mentality that we need to stay where we are and they need to, this is their words, stay where they are. Sure. And for me, how do you take a stand as a Christian and not be willing to be open to whoever? I believe the word says whosoever will, let them come.
Amen.
And so that is one of the challenges, changing the mindset of the people who are here, because the community is changing. When I first came here in 2014, I could stand in the window of the sanctuary and look out, and all I saw was African Americans. Right. Now, when I stand in the window and look out, I see diversity. And at some point, you're either going to embrace that diversity or it's going to push you out. And so how do you get a people who have been used to clustering or cloistering themselves together to embrace that diversity? That is one of the challenges.
Wow. Well, and it's not only a challenge there; it's a challenge in our country. It's a challenge of power.
Absolutely.
It's a challenge of power. It's a challenge of history that has been very difficult for the African American community. I just want to thank you for your candor on that, and also your friendship and reaching out to me over the year and a half that we've known each other. I've always found that to be a very embracing you to be a very embracing leader, and I appreciate that. When you look at the landscape of Woodlawn Baptist Church now, or let's just talk about your own history a little more. You mentioned that you came to St. John the Baptist Temple at age 6. So many people, Pastor, talk about the stories and how important stories are to helping those who are now entering into someone else's history. Can you tell us just a couple of stories about your own childhood in St. John the Baptist Temple? If the walls could speak, could you give today's listeners a sense of the ebb and flow of the life that took place in that building as some of your own personal memories?
Absolutely. When I first came there, I came from a little storefront church on 70th over West. It's now called Mount Hermon Baptist Church, and it's on 79th and Vincennes. It's a nice size, huge church now. But when I was attending there, we were in a little storefront, and so I come from a little storefront, a little 15 by 20 foot area into
St. John the
a
Baptist
1,400 seat sanctuary at the time. And I know it's 1,400 seats because I counted every one of them. And
yeah,
I'll say a little bit more.
Although the balcony, I don't think the balcony's got any seats left in it anymore. But yeah, counting the balcony.
Yeah, they cannibalize seats to repair seats down on the main floor. But for sure, it had 1,400 seats because I used to clean them. I used to wash each seat on the Saturdays. So I'm real familiar with the building per se. When I came there, it was a vibrant, huge church. It had what we called at the time clubs or auxiliaries. These were different ministry groups within the church. And at the time I came there, and I became more aware of this when I was 12 or so. But at the time I came there, it had about 40 different ministry groups in the church. And each group handled different aspects of ministry. There were 4 choirs in the group. There were 3 usher boards, 3 hospitality groups there. 2 of them being adults, 1 of them being youth. There was Sunday school that had 12 classes in it.
Wow.
And they were grouped by age groups. They had what they called at the time a junior church. And so the children, the youth, were allowed to conduct a church service for a half hour after the Sunday school, in between going to the main service. The church was very community oriented. I grew up with summer jobs at the church.
Wow.
And so the church would take on the city's programs and allow us to earn a paycheck during the summer.
Yeah.
I eventually became the leader of that program through the course of time. I have the pleasure of having been in almost every auxiliary or organization in the church. So I started out in the Sunday school. I was a junior usher at one time. I was the leader of the youth choir at one time. I was a deacon, a trustee, the treasurer of the church at one time, and the director and leader of the male chorus or male singing aggregation in the church. And so all of that went to making me who I am today.
Wow, that's
I
beautiful. And from what I understand, they relocated from about 50th Street or so in 1958. So I'm
correct.
guessing you and I are about the same age. So are you talking about mid late 60s at this point
Yes,
when you first came?
yes. So I
Any
first came in '62.
okay. Any anything you would say about the pastoral progression, or just even who the pastors were? A word or two about, well, when I came, it was this person, and then later it kind of ebbed and flowed, or any
So there's only been
memorable.
3 pastors since I've been there. The pastor that moved them from 50th Street over here was the father of the pastor who I served under, basically. I knew him, in point of fact, I remember riding to the airport with him one Sunday to pick up a guest minister. He wanted somebody to ride with him, and I was 12 at the time. And Jeff, come on and get in the car with me. He was an interesting person, very people oriented, very loving, very committed. I can remember times when my grandfather worked at the steel mill. And so one of the problems of working at the steel mill was they would go on strike every 2 or 3 years. And when they went on strike, your house kind of
Right.
had issues. And I can
Right.
remember the pastor coming and making sure we had food. That was the type of leader that he was. He was there until 1973. And at that time, I'm 14 years old. He preached my grandmother's funeral, my grandfather's funeral. He was just that. By the time I'm 13, I'm doing gardening work at his house.
Yeah.
And so I'm real familiar with him and the things that he did. When he took ill, there was a contention in the church because his son had started preaching at the age of 14, but had kind of gotten off of preaching. And 3 years prior to his taking ill, the son came back into ministry, was acting pastor at another church. And then when that pastor got himself back together, he came over here and was elected to be the pastor of the church and carry on his father's work. There was a little contention about that. Some people wanted to do something different.
Right.
He was a totally different person. He was very people oriented, but not very service oriented.
Now, would this be Benjamin Davis's father? No.
No, it's Benjamin Davis's spiritual father.
Okay, gotcha.
So he's the pastor that Benjamin Davis went into ministry under, just as he was the pastor that I entered into the ministry under.
Right.
It was a little interesting story. I went over to his house to give him a piece of my mind, to be honest with you. We were having a little back and forth, and we discussed it. We worked it all out. And I asked him a question. I asked him, how do you know if you've been called into ministry? And he gave me an answer. I won't go into all the details, but he gave me answers. And then he asked me a question. Do you believe you've been called into ministry? And when he asked that question, I found myself saying yes, even though I had no intention of saying yes.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of me and ministry. I served under him for 12 years. And during that time.
That's beautiful to think that you started attending a church at age 6, and then through the mentoring of the pastor and then the son later, you find your own way into ministry right out of St. John the Baptist.
Absolutely. I'm kind of a homebody. A lot of ministers go from church to church. I'm at home.
Now, did you, when that pastor passed away, his name again, you'll have to tell us, and then did you preach his funeral or?
No, I did not. So Pastor Newton Sr., the first pastor, had served from 1952 to 1973. And when he passed away, he was the vice president of the National Baptist Convention, USA.
Wow.
Which means in the Baptist church, he was like at the second highest rung of the church. And so the president of the Baptist Convention preached his service.
Wow.
And when he passed, I wasn't in ministry yet.
Right.
I actually made the motion at the church meeting where his son was elected to pastor. I was the person that brought forward a motion to have him elected. And so then kind of
I feel like the walls are talking right now.
Yeah, it was a little interesting.
Are there any, just for kind of enjoyment, Jackson used to sing in there on Christmas Eve, and that Mayor Harold Washington held some of his largest Southside rallies there when he was running. Were you present at any of these things, or is there anything you're like, wow, the thing had a vibe at a certain point where you talk about the significance of the pastor to a denomination. Tell me about the significance of the church to the community and anything there that you remember.
And so there are 3 times when that church building, to my knowledge, was completely full, meaning people were at the door, not able to get in. The balconies were full. Everywhere in the church was full. Those 3 times was one when Mahalia Jackson sang there. I was a child then, so I have no real recollection of it. I remember my grandmother talking about her coming and what that looked like. The second time was when Pastor Newton Sr.'s funeral was held there. And the third time was when Harold Washington came there. I was working the soundboard when Harold Washington gave his speech.
That's great.
So, yes, I was there for his event.
Let's just hit on that for a moment at a cultural level, because the significance of his election, and what that meant for the city, and for the African American community. Anything that you remember about that era, that moment, that you feel like, you know what, that was a significant movement of great strength that we would like to somehow get back to?
The thing that I remember most about Harold and his administration was his equanimity. He was determined that there was not going to be, we're going to get ours now because y'all kept us away. He put out to the community, and mind you, I'm 17, 18 years old now, and I'm hearing this, that yes, from a community perspective, we have been shortchanged in the past. I'm going to make it as equal as possible, but I'm not going to shortchange the other side of the community for this. That's not what's right. And that's what I remember most about him. I remember having city services that were lacking at one point. And I remember hearing people from other parts of town complaining that the amount of services they got were reduced because the amount of services that we got had increased. And the reality was that they were balancing, where
right.
Prior to that, they had always been unbalanced.
Right.
And so that's what I remember most about Harold. Harold would say, you want Harold? You got him now. And that meant very simply that I am who I am. And this is how it's going to be. No, you're not going to get everything you want. And no, you're not going to keep everything you have. This is going to come together. And that's the way it should be.
Yeah. So think about that, and right where we are now. So you and I will be neighboring pastors in a community that has felt pushed and pulled for decades and encroached on, and in some sense, a divestment of capital What would you say, having really been a son of that church and a leader in that community today, talk to us about the need of the hour for the gospel, for what a local church ought to be about, and yet for how we navigate all of the complexities that are on us right now with the new investment and the changes that are coming.
So the thing that I had to be most conscious of when I came here was that there is a group of broken people in the community who have what I would call a siege mentality. And their thought process is, we've been here through the thick and thin. I can remember when I could not walk up and down the street because there was craziness going on in the community. And I can remember when buildings were burning in the community. And these are the same people that went through that whole process. While everybody was running and leaving, they stayed and they held the community together. And now it feels like they're being pushed out of the community. It feels like at some point, I'm not going to be able to stay here for whatever reason. Financial, just that the complexity of the community has changed that I'm not wanting. A prime example of that is a block, right, 2 blocks to your east, called Kimbar.
Right.
And on Kimbar, the 6100 and 6200 block of Kimbar show the issues that are in the community. The 6100 block.
Tell me about that, because now you're hitting on something I'm not even familiar with. Tell me about this.
The 6100 block has 3 major public housing buildings. They are subsidized housing. The rest of the block, 6100 and 6200, the north end of 6100 and all of 6200 basically is homeowners. And so there's a tension between renters and homeowners and the way they live, even, as well as what having the subsidized housing is doing to the potential value of the homeowners. And so I find myself ever so often called to community meetings to kind of act as a referee between the homeowners and the tenants. I have a member who's 80 some odd years old that lives in the block. And for years, she was the president of the block club. And so her thought process is, my pastor can handle it. And she brings the church into the middle of the situation, which I believe the church should be in the middle of. And be able to say to the community, we got to come together. We can't be struggling against each other. We have to figure out how to be one. I look at the word community and I see unity in it. And so if we're going to be a community, there has to be some form of unity. We got to figure this out. I think that is the church's focal point and the gospel's focal point in this area.
Are you optimistic? Are you bullish on the next 5 years? Given 79% of Woodlawn residents rent, 21% own their own home. You talk about that difference between the owner and the renter. You're involved with our alderperson right now, Taylor, and do you feel like you were built for such a time as this? And are you optimistic or encouraged?
I am optimistic. You said 5 years, I say 10.
Okay.
So that's my level of optimism, that it's going to take more work than people seem to think it might take. And no, I don't think the community is going to completely change, because I think the community has always been a diverse community down through the years. And I believe that's what is supposed to be here. So the question is, how do you soothe the sore points and at the same time make them aware that change is not necessarily bad for you, that it can work to your advantage. It just depends on how you deal with the change. We have an older person who grew up in my former church. And so I'm very familiar with her stand. She and I served together on a local school council for about 4 years. And so I kind of know where her mind is in terms of the community. And she accepts that change is coming. She just says change has to be inclusive. And that's where the church comes in. How do we become inclusive as opposed to exclusive?
So let's hit on that. Let's come right down into the crux of a congregation like ours, because I'd like to hear your thoughts being 1 degree of separation away. We've been in the community, this community, 22 years. I mean, our first elder lived in Woodlawn. We have people in Woodlawn, but dominantly, our congregation has been still on the Hyde Park side and the Kenwood side. But as we now, and we've rented for 22 years, and now we're going to own space, and we're going to try to contribute to the community, to the restoration of a historically significant building. But what would you say to our church, to Christ Church, as it moves now into a 1 to 3 year transition? How would you speak to us about the sensitivities that are required and the entrance into being an owner-occupied church there? I'd love to hear from you on that, because you know the whole history of that church, and you also know all of the challenges presently in the neighborhood. Help us with what I'm saying.
I would say the very first thought that entered my head as you were asking your question is that one must come to the table open to differences, open to, I was thinking earlier today, how do you be in the world and not of the world, and yet be drawing to the world? Because that's the challenge in this community. I think the community has gotten to a point that it is in what I would call traditional church burnout.
Interesting.
It has seen what the church has been, and the demographics that are coming up now are saying, if that's what church is, I don't want it. Now, there is an expectation that I think is put on the church that is really not the church's to have. However, at some point, you've got to manage that expectation if you're going to integrate with the community, if you're going to be a part of the community instead of seen as outsiders coming in. And so, as I said, growing up in that building was always the place that you could come and get a meal. That building was always the place that you could bring your children to in the summer. They were going to have some kind of a summer program going that reached out to the kids. And oddly enough, the teenagers got paid for their time there to watch the younger kids. And so it worked out well because the church integrated itself into the community.
That's what I like to call the church being the church.
Absolutely.
That it's the people of God who are living as God's people there, but in a winsome way, and actually in an inviting, open way. My
theme song for years was "Brighten the Corner Where You Are." Okay, and it simply says, if all people know is that there's a building there that people come to on Sunday and leave, you're not the church. You're a religious organization in a building. If the people know that there are loving, caring people who are willing to extend themselves and reach out, even if in the reaching out they have to put some limits, then they will understand that, one, you are who you say you are. I had an interesting statement made by a young man that I was concerned about the other day, because he had been a part of my church for years. His son had gotten killed, and his whole mentality had changed. And he really had gone out on this negative thing about church people. And the other day, it was my anniversary or something. And he sent me a note. He says, I know you're aware of where my head is right now, but I want you to understand that I never think of you in that manner, in the things that I'm saying.
Right.
I think you're the real deal. Now, when he said that, I'm like, who, me? But I'm glad that he sees the openness, the honesty, that I can accept you in your state and not down you, criticize you, put you down in the state that you're in, and yet still let you know that there's a better way, that there is something that we are supposed to be ascribing to, we're supposed to be reaching for. And so that's the mission that I believe will make Christ Church successful. It doesn't hurt that you picked a name that used to be the name of the church across the street from you. It was Christ's Way Baptist Church.
Christ's Way, right.
And now you're Christ Church. Right. So I'm sure there's going to be some communication about that in the community.
Yeah. Well, we are prayerfully anticipating and eager to have a home, having been kind of nomadic for 22 years here. But in anchoring on that corner, we really desire to show the love of Christ and to proclaim the goodness of his gospel and to live it out in ways that are meaningful. And so your friendship to me matters. I'm grateful for your ministry. I'm thankful for your words today. Anything you want to say on the backside before I close and just ask God's blessing upon your continued work?
I would say welcome to the community. There's an old song that said there's plenty good room in my Father's kingdom. And for sure, there's plenty of work to be done. And so come in, roll up your sleeves, and go about doing what needs to be done. Woodlawn Baptist Church is willing to work with. In point of fact, we've had community events where the churches came together to sponsor the events. And one church would provide one part of it, one church would provide the other part, and we would share. And we would share the gospel. Because if the community can't see the church getting along, how are they going to get along?
Wow. That's a good word. It's a good word, my friend. Thank you.